Okay, well, hello and welcome, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the library for having me here today. But just as important, all of you who are curious enough to show up to talk about lumberjack history and legends and folklore from the comfort of wherever you're watching this program from. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you here. So bear with me 1 second here. So right now, all of you should see Wisconsin's lumberjack legends and lore. So with that, let's begin. As you heard, my name is Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, for the last 30 years, I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampires in Transylvania, weird roadside attractions, strange places, weird stories. If it's just strange and a bit odd, I've traveled the globe in search of unique history, anomalies, and just bizarre things that will attract your attention. But it seems as though at some point, I was always destined to cover lumberjacks. I was born in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, which, if you're not familiar, was nicknamed Sawdust City because of all the lumber mills that we had in our town. As a grade schooler, I took my field trips down to our local Paul Bunyan logging camp museum. There, we learned about the history of logging in our area and Wisconsin. When I went to college as an undergraduate and graduate student, I went to University of Wisconsin Stout, founded by James Huff Stout, a lumber baron. So it seemed like I should always be covering Wisconsin lumberjack legends and lore. And that's what we're going to cover today. We're going to take a time portal back to the days of the lumber industry. For the next 45, 50 minutes or so, we're going to discover some of the weirdest, most fascinating and bizarre lumberjack legends that you might not have known about. So with that, let's set the scene. Imagine Wisconsin before it was even a state, a territory. How much wood was available? In the north woods of Wisconsin, it was said that you could travel from tree to tree if you were an animal and never touch the ground for miles and miles on end, because the forests seemed to be limitless, never-ending forest. And that's when the heyday of logging really began. We're going to be focusing on the mid-1800s to early 1900s. Yes, logging continues today, but not in the same way that it did in the old days, which we will get to later. In the peak of logging, most people don't realize that over 100,000 men would head up to the North Woods every winter to cut the wood. Now, logging was mainly done in the winter months for several reasons. One, you didn't have to worry about the deadly mosquitoes terrorizing Wisconsin, or the ticks and the endless other bugs that would drive lumberjacks crazy otherwise. Also, in the winter, you could ice up the roads and the trails to make them slick so the horse or oxen could pull heavier loads of trees down to the riverbanks, where you would then store them and wait for the spring thaw of the winter coming into spring when all the snow melted. It would raise the rivers up high enough where you could shoot the logs down to all the lumber mills that were in the surrounding towns that would cut it up and ship it off, usually down south. Another reason it was done in the winter is because many of the lumberjacks were farmers. They would farm all season long, and then when winter came about, they'd head into the North Woods, leave their friends, family, and loved ones behind, and they'd head up and work through the winter, and then come back in the spring, hopefully with enough money to buy more land, more livestock, or save the family farm. And the lodging was built near the wood, obviously. But the lumber camps were really built to last 1 or maybe 2 seasons. They were built close enough to the river to haul the wood, but also close enough to the wood where the wood was. And they consisted of several main buildings. One would be the bunk house. This is where the lumberjacks would spend all the time they weren't in the woods at. And it wasn't a Holiday Inn. It was basically bunk beds set against the wall in the building, where you'd have your own little cubby space where you could come back and read at night, more likely tell stories around the fire, smoking your pipe and your tobacco. I would love to just peek my head into one of these bunk houses in the old days, travel back through time. You can imagine with the lice, the bed bugs, and several dozen men who haven't bathed in many weeks, all their wet wool clothes hanging near the fireplace. You can imagine the smell that must have been in one of these bunk houses. They also had the cook shanty, where the lumberjacks would go to eat and only eat. They normally would have both breakfast and supper at the cook shanty, with the midday meal, lunch, being brought out to site usually because it was too much to keep coming back. And when they went there to eat breakfast, that's what they did. They ate. Most lumber camps did not allow talking at the breakfast table, because if you were talking, you weren't eating. And if you were not eating, you would not have enough energy to make it through the brutal work days, which leads to the importance of the cook. Lumberjacks would often ship and move and shift to other lumber camps, and it didn't matter what the pay was, the cleanliness, the work conditions. It was how good the cook was. If your lumber camp had a great cook, you could keep a lot of the lumberjacks happy. And they would eat and eat and eat. For breakfast, they would have all kinds of things, from salted pork and pancakes all the way down to the bottom, where you see donuts, donuts, and donuts. The reason they gave them so many donuts is they were so cheap to make and full of energy. It wasn't as expensive as having the meat on your lumber camp. Here's a sample meal from 1917 at a lumber camp. And you can see it has all the favorites of children, of the liver and onions and the codfish cakes and the frankfurters. And of course, donuts and as many as you wanted. And then we get to the work. The work was brutally hard. They worked 6 days a week. Sundays were your day off, where it was expected that you would mend your clothing, fix your tools, and if you were very ambitious, you could boil your clothes to get all the bed bugs and lice off of them. Although for most lumberjacks, it was just too much work to do that. If there were any visitors allowed, which most times there weren't, it would be on a Sunday. And these visitors were usually the head honcho's family that were coming up to see how the lumberjacks actually survived. Most lumberjacks would not see their family for several months until the end of the season, even not taking a break for Christmas. And they worked every day from what they called can't see to can't see, where they would be up out of the bunk and heading to the woods while it was still dark, and they wouldn't be coming back to the cook shanty until after it was dark. So they would say, we're working from when we can't see to when we can't see. They would announce it in the morning as daylight in the swamp, time to get out and start working. Lumberjacks survived on two main things in those days: tobacco and coffee, and they consumed an insane amount of both of them. But the lumberjack camps, they were ahead of their time. They were some of the first people to offer equal pay for equal work, which meant that no matter where you came from, what language you spoke, what your religion was, what your skin color was, if you could do the same job as someone next to you, you would get paid the same amount, which is why there were many Native American lumberjacks. A lot of lumber camps were on reservation land. We had a lot of African American lumberjacks as well. And many of the lumberjacks were immigrants. They came over just to work in the lumber camps because they had that experience from their old home countries. There were so many immigrants that the old joke was that at night in the lumber camp, you could hear snoring in 10 different languages because that's how many immigrants were coming over. And when we think of these lumberjacks, we think of them as something like this, that big, strong, sturdy men that you wouldn't think would get spooked by anything. But keep in mind, in those days, the average height in 1909 was only 5 feet 6 inches for an American male. Most of the lumberjacks would have been pretty small by today's comparison, 5'3", 140 pounds-ish, but it didn't mean they couldn't work. They could. In fact, they prided themselves on the hard work. A lot of lumber camps would have unofficial competitions, whether who could make the most wood on a day, a week, a season. It wasn't for extra pay. It wasn't for a bonus. It was simply for bragging rights. They were hard workers, and it was expected that you would work hard as well. If you showed up at a lumber camp and you didn't like working very hard, you wouldn't make it very long there. They also needed specialized clothing. Most importantly, they needed stagged pants. These were pants that were cut off at the bottom, what you might call high waters today. The reason being is that when they were moving through the woods with snow all over the ground, their pants would get wet. And in the cold temperatures, they would freeze at the bottom, and you'd be basically walking around with 2 frozen boards on your legs. So they would cut the bottoms off to get rid of that extra dead weight. And as you might imagine, they looked at function over fashion. They were looking for clothes that were sturdy and strong, that would keep them warm, but also not wear out. For a lot of them, they were at the mercy of the camp store. This was another building on the site where the lumberjacks could come in and get all the supplies they needed, some treats, clothing, and it would just be docked from your pay at the end of the season. They would just keep track, and then they would take it away from your wages at the very end. Most lumber camps, the store, did not really make a huge profit. They weren't out to gouge the lumberjack. They were basically selling it at cost for the convenience. And you were forced to pick what the lumber store had. Hopefully they had a size of yours, not too big or not too small. Much different than today, where we just pick from hundreds and thousands of options of what we want to wear. Back then, again, they were at the mercy of the camp store that usually treated them very well. So they would come back season after season with that lumber company in a new place. Most of the lumberjacks had their turkey ready to go. That was their backpack. That was where they kept all of their goods, that if they ever needed to collect their days, their wages, and move to another outfit, they would have it all ready to go. Plus, many of them used their turkey as their pillow at night as a double purpose for the bag. And there were plenty of horses at the lumber camps as well. Although they could pull a huge amount of weight, horses had a drawback that they needed to be tended to. They needed to be groomed. They needed to be worked on. They had a specialized diet. Whereas a lot of lumberjacks liked working with the oxen because they would eat anything. You wouldn't have to groom them. You could leave them on their own. It was said that oxen had such a terrible and brutal physical short life at the lumber camps that when they died, they would become Hodags, which we will get to what a Hodag is a little bit later. I think today it's really difficult to overstate the economic engine that the lumber camps provided. Remember, back in those days, everything was made of wood, from all of your tools to your house, to even the shingles on your house were made of wood. So a lot of the prosperity that the Midwest was able to reach was because of the lumber industry, by far the biggest industry in the Great Lakes area. And like most people back then, lumberjacks were very superstitious. They had all sorts of weird rituals and customs that they abided by, including that the fact that if you walked into the room, if the wood was not facing vertically to you, you wouldn't want to walk in because it would signify bad luck or bring about mishap or misfortune to you. If you had to walk into a room with the wood facing against you, you could offset this by walking in backwards. It's also believed that you should only enter and exit the same door of the building so that you would not take the good luck or bad luck with you as you exited from one exit to the other. You'd always keep going in the same door you came in on. They also hated working with poplar, which was a bunch of trees that they just did not want to work with. They also had weird designs on wet clothing, believing that instead of changing, you should just let the clothes dry on you. Imagine how cold it must have been in those ice-filled rivers with the snow melting, and you're working there 10 hours a day, your clothes continually wet and then drying, wet and then drying. It's a miracle that more lumberjacks didn't die than the many that did. They also believe that you should be nice to rabbits, that if you see them, you should say something nice to them. Have a good day, bunny. Have a good day, rabbit. Otherwise, you'd be cursed with bad luck, that it was thought to bring about bad luck being rude to a rabbit. I don't know if the same custom was then granted to the jackalopes that were often on the western prairies and in the north woods, but maybe it was. Jackalopes, if you don't know, could often be heard out on the western prairies, right on the edge of the fire, singing along with cowboys as they sang their songs around the campfire. In the lumber camps, they believed that these jackalopes would hum along with the saw or the sound of an axe hitting the trees. We'll get into some weird, mysterious creatures a little bit later. The lumberjacks also thought there were weird lights in the woods. Pardon me. These spook lights, the willow of the wisp, these fairy fire or swamp gas, these mysterious lights that would move, change in size, shape, and color as they maneuvered through the big woods. People often ask, did lumberjacks ever report seeing Bigfoot type creatures? And yes, they did. But of course, they didn't call them Bigfoot back then. And they certainly didn't even call them Sasquatch back then. Usually they just reported these giant creatures in the woods. Often in those days, the reports of these things were called wild men. And they came in two categories, either a giant gorilla type form on your right there, or more of the loner, the man who lived in the woods on his own and allowed his whiskers, his beard to grow very long and his hair, and really reverted back to a primitive man. So the wild man or wild men could be seen as either of these back in the day. And to make matters even worse, when we get to some of the weirder creatures, sorting fact from fiction from these lumberjacks who love to spin yarns and tell tall tales is very difficult. And they had the most dangerous job in America. You can imagine cutting down 1,000-pound trees, swinging heavy equipment around. There's going to be some accidents and deaths. If you were hurt out in the woods, they would simply plug up your cut with a plug of tobacco and wrap it around. And when you got back to the bunk house, hopefully somebody with some medical training could stitch you up if it wasn't too bad. Many lumberjacks died on the job. If they were lucky, they were buried in a barrel or between two long pieces of wood. Sometimes lumberjacks, they wouldn't even know each other's real names. You might be known as Milwaukee Mike or West Side Willie. They wouldn't even know your exact name to tell your next of kin of your death. Many lumberjacks met their watery grave in the rivers as they were trying to do the log runs down the river. Usually when this happened, when they retrieved the body, they would bury it on the side of the river and nail the boots to the lumberjack up in a tree. So if you're ever walking out in the woods and you see boots nailed to a tree, it might signify that there was a dead lumberjack there buried somewhere near that vicinity. The most iconic lumberjack is without a doubt that of Paul Bunyan. Everyone seems to be familiar with the legend of Paul. Keep in mind, here in Wisconsin, we claim to be the birthplace of Paul Bunyan. But before we get too excited, so do the states of Minnesota, Maine, Michigan, Vermont, Canada, country of Canada, even California claims to be the birthplace of Paul Bunyan. But what we do know so far is that the first oral tales of Paul seem to have originated in a camp north of Tomahawk, Wisconsin, during the winter of about 1885 through 1886. That's when the first stories of Paul started to circulate. So we can claim to be the first oral tales of Paul Bunyan. But the first written tale that's been found happened in a Minnesota newspaper in 1904 called Caught on the Run. So Minnesota can claim to be the birthplace of the written form of Paul Bunyan. Regardless of where Paul's from, which we all know it's Wisconsin, this is what we think of Paul Bunyan as being today: the brawny, tall, strapping, heavily muscled, square-jawed lumberjack with the beard. But in the old days, they saw Paul Bunyan a little bit differently. How so? What did they think of him back then? Well, maybe I better let you just take a look. How's this for Paul Bunyan in the old days? You can see a sketch of Paul here, 1916. He looks more like a caveman coming out of the woods, half human, half wild monstrosity coming out fully on fire. As the years went by, his image softened. This is what he looked like in the early 1900s, the 20s, 30s, 40s, when they used his depiction of him on their lumber advertisements. Quite a bit different than how we see Paul and Babe today. But Paul, of course, was born in Wisconsin, and the birth was a huge deal. He had a humongous appetite. Legend tells that his skillet was so big that his cooks would strap bacon and butter onto their feet and skate around the skillet, greasing it up to get it ready for the meals. It got to be so much they had to make a few restaurants for Paul, the first of which happened in 1958 in Wisconsin Dells. It was Paul Bunyan's Lumberjack cook shanty. They have a 15-foot statue for him, and in true lumberjack fashion, it's an all-you-can-eat affair. They keep bringing you everything you want. And I always tell children and kids that when they go there, eat as many donuts for breakfast as you want. Tell your parents you're not eating an unhealthy breakfast. You're following history. You're following in the footsteps of the lumberjacks by eating as many donuts as you want. Just don't tell them I told you to do that. A few years later, up in the Northwoods of Wisconsin, they opened another one in Minocqua, another Paul and Babe, just to satisfy the hunger of the lumberjacks. And they constructed the world's largest six-pack in La Crosse, Wisconsin. This is the equivalent of 7 million 12-ounce cans. The Paul Bunyan six-pack, that if you were to drink a six-pack a day, it would take you about 3,300 years to finish off Paul Bunyan's six-pack. In 2003, he got sick of the brand and changed it to La Crosse Lager. The lumber camps were full of prunes back in those days. Paul Bunyan would give them to all the lumberjacks. They loved it in all of their baked goods and treats and pies, but you had to get rid of the pits. So what they would do in the beginning is just put wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of pits out into the woods. But what they discovered is that the chipmunks started eating these pits, and somehow it made them grow to an enormous size where they started killing the bear, the elk, the moose of the area. Even a panther could be taken down by the camp chipmunk. It got to be so much that Paul and the rest of the lumberjacks had to go on a shooting expedition, getting rid of all the camp chipmunks. Although those who visit the Northwoods say that there's still some of these large critters still up in the Northwoods. And everyone's familiar with Paul and Babe the Blue Ox, but a lot of people have no idea how Paul met Babe the Blue Ox. Well, they met in the winter of the blue snow. It was such a terrible winter that people were cursing a blue streak so long that it turned all the snow in the Midwest blue. That's when Paul met Babe. The winter was so terrible that they actually recorded it that season as having 2 winters because it was so bad. It was so cold that winter. What's that? How cold was it? It was so cold that fish grew fur to stay warm in Wisconsin lakes and rivers. It was so cold. How cold was it? It was so cold that at night, your words would freeze in the air. You'd have to wait until the morning thaw to hear what your friend was telling you from the night before. That's how cold it was when Paul found Babe. Babe was already in the snow for so long he had turned blue. And like everything around Paul, he brought him into his bunk house, and Babe grew to an enormous size, and Paul and Babe were friends ever since. Later in his life, Babe started marrying Bessie the yellow cow. And Paul and Babe are responsible for much of the Midwest. Now, Paul was an avid outdoorsman, as you can imagine. He loved to hunt and fish. A lot of his finds are still on display. If you go to Hayward, you'll see his muskie that he caught. It's the world's largest at 143 feet long, 4 stories high. They've had weddings in there. In Shell Lake, they have one of his fish on hand, and it was a 2-tailed walleye that Paul caught. And even though they did the lumber camps in the winter, they still had to contend with the Wisconsin deadly and dreaded mosquito. These mosquitoes were so big that it was said they could lift a full-grown lumberjack right off of the banks of the river, and they'd never be seen from again. Every year, many lumberjacks were carried off, never to be seen from again. So the lumber camps turned to Paul Bunyan. He was very creative, very intelligent. And Paul remembered that he had a similar situation when he was logging in the south of the U.S., and he was plagued by giant bees. So Paul had an idea. He would have his men bring up these bees to attack the mosquitoes and kill them. So that's what they did. And we know this really happened because we have this drawing showing the bees coming up from the south to fight the mosquitoes of the north. But Paul's plan backfired on him. The mosquitoes got along well with the bees. They even started dating and marrying one another, producing offspring that were called the bee-skeeto. It would have a stinger on each end of its body, so it could get you whether you were coming or going. Worse yet, some of these mated with fireflies and produced a bee-skeeto that could see in the dark, so you weren't even safe at night from these crazy creatures coming after you. Paul also had his dog with him, Sport, the reversible dog. What happened was when Sport came into the lumber camp, Paul thought he was a rat. So he threw his hatchet at him and cut him in half. It was dark, and when Paul walked over, he realized it was a dog. So he quickly stitched it together, wrapped it in a flannel blanket, and nursed it back to health. When he took off the wrappings, he realized that in his haste, he had stitched it up the wrong way. Its back legs were facing the sky rather than the ground. But this turned out to be a great source for Sport, because it was said that Sport could track down any prey because it would run on its front legs until he got tired. Then he would flip over onto his back legs. And when they got tired, he'd flip back and forth, meaning that he would never get tired and could run all day long. Paul also had his trusty accountant, Johnny Inkslinger. Some said that Johnny Inkslinger used a split pencil so he could charge the Lumberjacks twice for each of their purchases. But those who knew him said that was a bunch of bunk shanty talk, or where the word bunk comes from, meaning not true, a lie. That's a load of bunk. Outside of Paul, the only person that could handle Babe the Blue Ox was Brimstone Bill. One of the reasons he could handle Babe is that it was said that Brimstone could swear for 30 minutes straight without ever repeating the same swear word. That's how he was able to handle Babe the Blue Ox. Today, we celebrate Paul Bunyan through the competition between the University of Minnesota and Wisconsin's football teams. The tradition of Paul Bunyan's axe began back in 1948 after Wisconsin lost the slab of bacon and would not give it back to Minnesota. That's when the axe began. As of today, there have been 130 meetings of these two teams. How many of you believe that Minnesota's in the lead of these 130? Probably not many. What about Wisconsin? Well, of course you'd be right. Wisconsin is ahead, but only slightly. Last year, they did not play due to the pandemic, but they are slated to play this year, and we can see if we can keep Paul's axe with us. Then we get to the tragic story of the death of Paul and Babe. If you believe the legend, Paul is buried up on Rib Mountain in Wausau, Wisconsin, and Babe is at a nearby hill overlooking. But I think the stories of Paul and Babe dying, they're the biggest tall tale of them all. Everyone knows Paul and Babe are still roaming the northwoods of the Midwest, looking for their new lumber camp. And if you ever head up north, odds are you'll find Paul and Babe maneuvering about. But Paul and Babe weren't the weirdest things in the lumber camp. Imagine the lumber camp believed in a lot of creatures, because at night, when you're in the lumber camp and the wind's whipping through and howling, you'd have to tell stories and spin yarns. And often the grizzled lumberjacks would want to scare or initiate the young greenhorns, the rookies. And at that time, it was thought that the woods were inexhaustible. You could never get rid of them. It's just so big that anything could be living there, including the Hodag. If you've never heard of the Hodag, it looks something like you're seeing here, this giant lizard dinosaur with spikes down its back, huge fangs and claws. No one in America knew more about the Hodag than this gentleman. He was out of Rhinelander, Eugene Shepard. He was a timber cruiser, which meant he went scouting the woods to see how much money would be there for the timber companies to make their decision to buy the land. But he said he encountered a Hodag out in the wild. Not only did he encounter it, he went out and captured it with some of his hunting buddies. He then put it on display at the local carnivals and fairs throughout the county and Wisconsin. Then he brought it back to his house in Rhinelander, dug a big pit, and had his children maneuvering it down in the pit. When people found out it was a hoax, he said, "Of course I hoaxed it. They're too dangerous to capture one. I'm not crazy. They're out there, but they're too deadly. Stay away." You can't believe how many people contact me every year asking where they can go to find a real Hodag. Usually I tell them, go to Rhinelander. They're everywhere in Rhinelander. Eugene Shepard was credited with spreading the Hodag legend. Also, many believe that Eugene Shepard may have created the legend of Paul Bunyan. And if he didn't, he was certainly one of the earliest tellers of Paul tales. But don't worry, as deadly as the Hodag looks, you don't have to worry too much, because it was said that it would only eat white bulldogs on Sundays. Some say the Hodag was a hoax, which I tell you then, why do we not see more white bulldogs today? Where'd they all go? It's because the Hodag has consumed them all. They also believed in the hoop snake, a snake that could grab its own tail in its mouth and then create a circle, a hoop, and chase you at high speeds. But there were several ways to get rid of this. One, you could run through a fence because it would not be able to get through. You could run uphill, which would slow it down but not stop it. But the best way was when it was chasing you was to jump through the circle. That would confuse the snake long enough for it to lose concentration and fall over. You might think running up a tree would be good, but the hoop snake would simply just wait for you at the bottom of a tree. There were many men who were coming home from the saloon late, telling their families that they had been treed by a hoop snake, and that's why they were late. If the hoop snake bit you, you would die from the venom of its bite. And you might think having a dog around the lumber camp would be a good thing. And it would, except for this dog, the axe handle hound. It got its unique shape because it would only eat the axe handles left behind out at night by the clumsy lumberjack who wasn't putting it into protection. And it would eat so many of these that it took on the shape of an axe handle. It was said that just one axe handle hound could eat a lumber camp into bankruptcy in one season because it had an insatiable hunger for axe handles. I've done this program quite a bit and talked about all these legendary creatures. The one that seems to be a favorite of people is this next one, the Hodag. It was a large creature, much like a moose. If you had to say it resembled something, think of Snuffleupagus from Sesame Street. It was a huge creature with its mouth and lips that would hang down to the forest floor. And it had no knees, which meant it couldn't bend down or even lay down to sleep, which meant it would crash through the woods and you could hear it pretty easily. But it was said it was very hard to track because it never got tired. So instead, hunters realized that at night, it would lean its bulk up against a tree to sleep, keeping it upright. So what they would do, the lumberjacks and the hunters would cut the trees halfway so that when the Hodag leaned up against them, it would fall over, knock the tree down, and it wouldn't be able to get up and they could hunt it. Plus, it would do half the work of knocking the tree over for you as well. Some say these things were hunted into extinction, where others claim they're still up in the Northwoods to this very day. The newspaper said they were dim-witted and of low intelligence. They would make a great pet if you could capture one. And most of these animals weren't extremely dangerous. But this next one was because it had a gripe against humans. Remember back in those days, the lumberjack did not practice environmental sciences. There was no cutting and then replanting. There was no saving some. It was clear cut everything and then sell the land to some sucker who would try to farm it. So this next creature, the agropelter, was upset that the lumberjacks were destroying its home. So what it would do is sit up in the top of a hollowed out tree. And when unsuspecting people would come hiking through the woods or lumberjacks, looking at the ground so they wouldn't trip, these things would smash them with the stick and kill them and then hide in the hollowed out logs. It was said that the agropelter was resentful of humans destroying its habitat, which they did. Or you'd have to worry about the splinter cat. The size of a cougar or a mountain lion, the splinter cat hunted bees and hollow trees. And it had a head like an anvil, where it would jump out of a tree and smash its head into another tree, cracking it open, looking for the beehives inside. It too wasn't thought to be very intelligent, which meant it had poor eyesight. And many lumberjacks, the last thing they saw in this life was the anvil head of a splinter cat coming toward them, as the splinter cat mistook them for a tree and crashed into them. At night, during blizzards, when the wind was cracking trees and the cold was shattering the limbs, That wasn't the weather, of course. Greenhorns thought that. Grizzled veterans of the woods knew that that was the sign of a splinter cat, and you better get inside. This next creature is one that you might hear, you might smell it, you might feel it by you, but you'll never see it. How many of you have been walking out in the woods when you get a sense that something's behind you, but when you turn around, nothing's there? Hoping that it's a fellow hiker, you'd be mistaken, because it's a creature called the hide behind. And just as its name implies, it would hide behind you. If you were standing in the woods, it would be behind you. If you jumped 180 degrees, it would still be behind you. It would hide behind anything in the woods waiting to take you off. It could hide behind a rock, a tree, some branch. It was said that the hide behind became so good at hiding, it could hide behind itself. And then it would capture you and tear you off to its lair where you'd never be seen or heard from again. A very deadly creature. Some say it's never been seen, so we don't know exactly what it looks like. We estimate that it probably looks something like this, but who knows? And some animals were deadly, like the hide behind. Others just adapted to their environment, like the side hill gouger. The side hill gouger was a creature that spent all of its time up on steep cliffs and hills. So over the years, it adapted by growing part of its body much longer than the other part, the other half, so it could walk easily on steep inclines throughout. And it could walk throughout and not tip over. But there were two species of these side hill gougers. One that would walk counterclockwise and one that could walk clockwise. And for obvious reasons, they could never mate and produce offspring. So the species have stayed separate this entire time. If you're watching and coming after one of these things, all you have to do is turn around and run the other way, because it can't turn around, or run down the hill. And when it tries to follow, it will tumble over and go down, and it will be so confused it could never come back up on the mountain or the hill, and you could get away from the side hill gouger. You also had to watch out for the air, for a creature called the goofus bird. Now, this thing loved to fly backwards because it didn't care where it was going. It only cared where it had been. It would nest upside down in a tree, and you could hear it flying past you as you saw its beak move in the distance rather than its backside. So they had all these creatures that they believed in, which was just something you do at night, telling stories around the fire in the bunk house. But a lot of people claim that the lumberjack legend and history is gone. And in some ways it is gone. Today, the lumber industry is much different. It's usually a couple person crew. They're working with heavy machinery. They're at home at night or at a nearby hotel. They're not spending months on end at a cabin surrounded by hundreds of other lumberjacks. So in that regard, the lumber industry is gone. The lumberjack is gone. The way we think of it is the old days. And a lot of the stories that were told back at the lumber camps, they weren't told the way I spun them for you today. Someone would usually start about a tale saying that they worked with Paul Bunyan and this is what happened, when someone else would jump in and say, you got it wrong. I was up on the Onion River with Paul. This is how it happened. So the stories were morphing and progressing, and they'd always be embellished more and more. The same story was never told the same way twice. And these people were expert storytellers. And when the first anthropologists and sociologists and researchers and folklorists and historians would go to the lumber camps, they would collect these stories about Paul Bunyan and many others. But what the researchers found is that the old stories about Paul, where they were all bragging about his sexual prowess, they were racist, they were bigoted, they were sexist, where the researchers couldn't publish them because it would be obscene. They'd get arrested. So we lost many of the early lumberjack stories about Paul Bunyan. Most of the legends we know about Paul today came out in the early 1900s. So the early legends about Paul, we simply missed out on them. But I think that as long as people head to the Northwoods, whether you're going up to a cabin or for a vacation, or you're sitting around the fire, as long as people want to tell tall tales, as long as people congregate around a fire or at a cabin, I think the lumberjack legends and lore will continue on forever. They will never be forgotten. And with that, I wanted to save the last 10 minutes or so that we have for any questions, comments, or stories that any of you might have. If you want more information, my website has more than you could ever possibly want or need. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here today with this program. Grab one of my books, go on your own adventure of the area. And when you do, I think you'll discover that we live in one heck of a weird state. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some weird people. And on your adventure, you might just discover that the strangest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I want to thank the library for putting this on. I can't think of a time in America's history in which the library has played a more crucial role than it does in today's world. With everything going on today in America with politics, societal issues, the pandemic, libraries are the fabric that keep our community together, a real treasure. Just to show my appreciation, if you want to go to my website and get any of my books, just type in the coupon code library. You'll get 20% off everything just because the library is so amazing.